Hello, friends. Night has already fallen, and the day was long and tiring. And now, it is time to rest. As always, I will tell you a kind legend that once took place in our beloved Middle-earth. So, settle in comfortably, gently close your eyes, and let our journey begin. The wind rolled down from the white mountains, sharp and cold, carrying with it the scent of smoke. It swept over the grassy plains of Rohan, bending the golden fields that stretched to the horizon, and whispered through the lonely ridges where the herds once grazed in peace. But this night, the wind bore other sounds as well. Distant cries, the clash of iron, and the thundering of hooves that did not belong to horses. A shadow had fallen over the western borders of the Riddermark. Villages near the river Entwash had begun to vanish, first one, then another, leaving behind blackened ruins and silence. The riders of Rohan spoke in hushed voices of creatures that struck under moonlight. Orcs mounted on great wolfish beasts, faster than any man's steed and twice as cruel. They called themselves the Legion of Terror. In the stronghold of Aldburg, the riders gathered beneath the banner of the Horse Lords. The mead hall was quiet, but for the creak of the timbers and the steady tread of boots upon the floor. At the center stood Eofrid, a young rider of the Mark, not yet 30, with keen grey eyes and the bearing of one born to the saddle. He had seen battle before, skirmishes with Dunlendings along the Isen, but never had he heard tales such as these. Before him, Captain Herewald, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, unrolled a map across the table. 2 nights passed, he said, his voice heavy. The hamlet of Frithgar was burned, no survivors found. The tracks lead eastward, hoofprints and claw marks together. The mark of orcs on beasts out of Mordor. Wargs, murmured Eofrid, his hand tightening upon the hilt of his sword. I thought such creatures kept to the north. So did we all, said Herewald grimly. But it seems some have been roused from their holes. Saruman's hand may be in this. There are whispers from the Westfold. Men have seen strange riders in black cloaks near the borders of Isengard. A hush fell. Even the fire seemed to burn lower at that name. Herewald's gaze turned to Eofrid. You will take 10 riders and ride at dawn. Follow the Entwash north until you find their trail. Bring back word of what you see. But if there are prisoners, you will do all you can to save them. Theoden King will have truth, not rumor. Eofrid bowed his head. I will not fail you, my lord. Outside, the dawn broke pale and cold over the plains. Eofrid mounted his steed, Faerwin, a mare swift as wind and steady as stone. Around him, his company gathered, grim-faced riders with spears gleaming in the half-light. They rode in silence, save for the soft clink of mail and the murmur of leather reins. For 3 days they followed the trail along the river's edge. Smoke hung in the air like mist, and the ground bore the marks of violence. Trampled earth, scorched timbers, and the footprints of beasts larger than any wolf. Once, they found a broken shield half buried in the mud, bearing the white horse of Rohan, its edge bitten clean through by iron teeth. On the evening of the 3rd day, they came upon the ruins of another village. The sky was red with sunset, but the ashes beneath were still warm. A child's toy, a wooden horse, lay half burnt beside a shattered door. Eofrid dismounted and knelt beside it, his face pale in the dim light. By Bema, whispered one of the riders. They slaughtered them all. Not all, said Eofrid, pointing to the ground. See here, tracks, smaller feet, dragged eastward. Prisoners. The riders followed the trail into the dusk, until the light faded from the sky, and the plains lay silver under the rising moon. Far ahead, a flicker of movement caught Aelfred's eye. Shadows crossing the ridges, low and swift. He raised his hand, signaling silence. The wind shifted, and a foul stench drifted toward them, rotting meat and damp fur. Then they heard it, the growl of wargs. A shriek split the night as a torch flared upon the hilltop. From the darkness, shapes emerged. Tall, twisted orcs, clad in mismatched armor, mounted upon hulking beasts with red eyes that gleamed like coals. The largest among them bore a crude banner, a black claw upon a red field. "Musgul," one of the riders hissed, "the war chief of the Legion." The orc leader raised a jagged blade and bellowed in the black tongue. At his cry, the wargs leapt forward, teeth flashing. Aelfred's heart surged with fire. He spurred Faerowyn into motion and drew his sword, the steel catching the moonlight. "For the mark!" he shouted, and the riders answered with one voice, a thunderous cry that rolled across the plains. The two forces met in a crash of fury and flame. Spears struck, wargs snarled, and the earth shook with the weight of battle. Aelfred's blade found the throat of one beast, then another. But the orcs came on without fear, their laughter harsh and cruel. Through the chaos he glimpsed Musgul, taller than the rest, his helm crowned with cruel spikes, his warg black as shadow. Their eyes met for an instant across the fray, and Aelfred felt a chill that pierced deeper than steel. Then the orc turned and fled into the night, his banner streaming behind him, and the remaining raiders followed in his wake. When the battle ended, silence fell once more, broken only by the panting of the horses and the crackle of dying fires. Aelfred stood among the fallen, his sword dark with blood. Around him lay the bodies of men and beasts alike. Of his 10 riders, only 6 remained. He looked eastward, where the moon hung low over the dark horizon. "He runs," Aelfred said quietly, "but he will not run far." And with that, he mounted once more and rode into the shadows, following the trail of the orc riders, the Legion of Terror. The night deepened as Aelfred and his riders pressed eastward, their horses weary but unyielding beneath them. The stars gleamed coldly overhead, and the moon rode high, pale and watchful. Along the plains, the wind moved like a living thing, whispering in the grasses, sighing through the hollow remains of villages long forsaken. Every sound seemed sharp in the stillness, the jingle of harness, the distant howl of wolves, the faint splash of the Entwash running black under the sky. They had followed the orc trail for many leagues. Here and there, they found the scattered remnants of the legions passing, a broken spear haft, a torn scrap of black banner, the marks of iron-shod paws pressed deep into the soil. Sometimes they glimpsed smoke rising in the distance, warning of another ruin, another farmstead put to the torch before they could reach it. At dawn, the riders halted by a stand of birches that grew near the river. Mist coiled around their legs, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. Aelfred dismounted, crouching beside the muddy ground. He brushed his fingers over a set of tracks, deep prints, fresh, leading north and east. "They ride hard," he murmured. "The beasts will tire before long." One of his men, a grizzled rider named Harnulf, leaned on his spear. "And when they do, they'll turn to ground of their choosing. They're not fools, these orcs. Musgul's too cunning for that." Aelfred nodded. He had learned enough of war to know that pursuit was as perilous as flight. But the thought of those taken from the villages, the cries that might even now echo in the dark, gave him no peace. They rode again, keeping low along the riverbanks until the land began to rise, and the grass gave way to clusters of old oaks. By midday, they reached the edge of Fangorn's shadow. The forest loomed vast and ancient, its trees towering like pillars of stone, their crowns lost in dim green twilight. A hush fell upon the riders, for none of the mark entered that wood lightly. "By Bema," muttered one, "I'd rather face 10 wargs in open field than set foot in there." "There is no need. Yet," said Eofrid. "The Orc's trail turns north, along the forest's edge. We follow." So they rode beside the eaves of Fangorn for 2 days more. Rain came, thin and cold, drumming upon their cloaks and helms. On the second night, they found the remains of a camp, ashes still warm, gnawed bones cast aside, and the unmistakable stink of orcs. Among the debris lay a broken helm of Rohan and a woman's torn shawl. Eofrid's jaw tightened. They camped here not half a day ago. They moved toward the northern fens. Harnulf, scout ahead. If they cross into the marshland, we must cut them off before the ground turns treacherous. Harnulf bowed his head and vanished into the mist, light-footed despite his mail. The others waited in silence, tending their horses and sharpening their blades. The forest whispered beside them, strange creaks and sighs rising from within its heart, as though the trees themselves murmured of ancient things best left undisturbed. Night fell again, and with it came Harnulf, his face drawn and pale. "I found them," he said, "a mile to the north by the reeds. They've built a crude pen for their captives. I saw 4, perhaps 5 villagers still alive. The rest?" He shook his head. "There are too many orcs to count, and wargs everywhere. They mean to stay the night." Eofrid rose swiftly. "Then we strike before dawn." He gathered his riders close, speaking low and steady. "We have numbers against us, but they do not expect pursuit. We will strike from the west, where the ground rises. The light will be behind us when the sun breaks. Remember the prisoners. Free them if you can. But if all fails, see that Musgul does not escape alive." There were grim nods all around. Each man checked his gear once more, murmured a word to his horse, and prepared for what dawn would bring. The hours crept slowly. The rain ceased, and a thin fog rolled in from the marshes. When at last the first light touched the eastern sky, the riders mounted and advanced, silent as shadows. Ahead, faint shapes moved in the dimness. Orcs crouched beside dying fires, their wargs curled in restless sleep. Eofrid raised his hand, and the riders of the mark charged. They came thundering out of the mist like the wrath of the storm, spears leveled, cloaks streaming. The first orcs had no time to cry out before the spears struck home. The camp erupted in chaos, snarling beasts, clashing blades, and the wild cries of men and orcs alike. Eofrid's sword flashed, cutting down a warg as it lunged. He swung again, cleaving through the armor of another foe, his heart beating with the fierce fire of battle. The air filled with the stench of blood and smoke. Through the melee, he saw them, the captives, bound near the fire pit. 2 riders dismounted and cut them free, urging them toward the safety of the trees. But even as they turned, a roar broke from the far side of the camp. Musgul had come. He rode a monstrous warg, black as pitch, its eyes burning red. His helm was wrought like a skull, and in his hand he bore a curved blade that gleamed with a foul light. Around him gathered a knot of his fiercest warriors, rallying to his call. Eofrid met his gaze once more, just as he had on that first night. No words passed between them, only the understanding that one would not leave this battle alive. "Musgul!" Eofrid cried, his voice ringing over the din. "Come then, coward of Isengard! Face me if you dare!" The Orc Lord laughed, a sound like breaking stone. "You will die, horseboy. The lands of the Mark will burn." With a howl, Musgul spurred his beast forward. The ground trembled as they clashed. Eofrid's sword met the orc's curved blade, sparks flying. Once, Twice, 3 times they struck, each blow ringing with fury. The warg snapped at Fairwind's throat, but she reared, hooves flashing, striking the beast's flank. Musgul's arm swung wide. Eofred ducked low and drove his sword into the warg's shoulder. The creature screamed, bucking in pain. Musgul leapt clear, landing with the agility of a predator. He hurled a dagger that grazed Eofred's arm, tearing through his sleeve. "Not yet, rider," he snarled. "Your blood will stain the marshes before dawn." Before Eofred could answer, the orc turned and vanished into the smoke, retreating toward the river. His warriors covered his flight, fighting with savage desperation. The riders pressed on, cutting them down one by one, until only silence remained. When the sun finally broke the horizon, its light fell upon a field strewn with the dead. The captives huddled together, weeping softly, while the surviving riders tended their wounded. Harnulf limped forward, blood staining his mail. "He's gone," he said. "Escaped eastward into the fens. We found the mark of the white hand on his banner." Eofred stared into the distance, where the mists lay thick over the marsh. "Then we know whose spawn he serves," he said grimly. "Saruman's reach grows longer than we guessed." He turned to his men. "We ride after him. We end this now, before he can strike again." The wind rose once more, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and iron. Somewhere far ahead, in the gathering fog, a deep growl echoed, the promise of another battle yet to come. And so the hunt continued, into the shadowed lands where few dared to follow, and where the Legion of Terror would make its final stand. The mists of the fens lay thick and heavy, dulling all color from the waking world. What once had been fair green marshland was now a mire of stagnant pools and whispering reeds. Crows wheeled above the shallows, crying out as though warning the living away. The air smelled of decay and old battles long forgotten. Eofred's company advanced slowly, their mounts sinking into the sodden ground with each step. The land here was treacherous, the paths uncertain. Pools that looked shallow could swallow a horse to the belly. Ridges that seemed firm could crumble beneath a single hoof, yet still they rode on, driven by the trail that wound like a dark thread through the mist. All that day, they followed the signs of Musgul's flight. Bent reeds, claw marks, the black blood of wargs spattered upon the stones. At times, faint cries echoed across the water. Sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else. The orcs were not far ahead. By nightfall, they came to a narrow stretch of dry ground where the river split in two, its channels winding around a low hill crowned by willows. There they halted to rest. A pale fire was kindled, and the riders huddled close beneath their cloaks. The fog moved around them in slow, silent eddies, and the stars above were faint and cold. Harnulf spoke first. "They'll not run much farther," he said, turning a strip of dried meat in his hands. "The wargs tire, and they'll seek firm ground soon. If we press them at dawn, we might drive them against the forest edge." Eofred nodded. "If the fens don't swallow us first?" He rose and walked to the edge of the firelight, gazing into the shifting mist. Every sense was alert, for in this place even the night seemed to listen. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them, though whether beast, orc, or darker thing, he could not tell. As he stood there, something caught his ear, a faint rustle, far off, like the soft tread of paws upon wet earth. He turned sharply, hand on sword hilt, but saw nothing save the curling vapors. Then, from somewhere beyond sight, came a low growl, deep and menacing. "On guard!" he called. The riders leapt to their feet, weapons drawn. The horses stamped and whinnied, eyes rolling white. Out of the mist came shapes, low and swift, wargs, silent as shadows until the moment they struck. The camp erupted in chaos. Spears flew, swords flashed, and the air filled with snarls and shouts. Eofred cut down the first beast that lunged at him, its body crashing into the mud. A second came from the side. Faerowyn reared, hooves striking, and the creature went down with a broken cry. Harnulf fought back to back with him, his spear thrusting again and again into the writhing shapes. "They've found us!" Harnulf shouted. "By the Vala, how did they—" An arrow whistled from the darkness and struck him in the shoulder, cutting off his words. He staggered but did not fall, wrenching the shaft free with a snarl. "Orcs among them!" he gasped. "They come behind, the beasts!" Indeed, from the thick of the mist came the guttural roars of the Legion, harsh and mocking. Fire flared, a torch hurled through the gloom, and the world lit in savage red. Orcs poured from the shadows, their blades gleaming wetly, their eyes alight with madness. Eofred's heart blazed with fury. "Riders of the Mark!" he cried. "To me! Strike for Rohan!" They charged through the swirling fog, their battle cries echoing like thunder over the marshes. Steel met steel. Wargs howled and fell. The clash raged long into the dark hours. The ground turned black with blood and rain. When at last the mist thinned and the first grey light of morning showed, the field lay strewn with the slain. The surviving orcs had fled once more into the marshes. The riders stood weary but unbroken, their armor dented, their blades dull from use. Harnulf sat against a stone, his wounded arm bound. Eofred looked about the field, his gaze grave. "They test us," he said quietly. "They mean to wear us down before the end." He sheathed his sword and turned toward the east. The mists there were darker, denser, as though a deeper shadow waited within. Somewhere beyond that veil, Musgul and the remnant of his legion hid, plotting their next strike. They rested a short while, then rode on. As the day wore, the marshes grew wilder. Strange shapes moved beneath the water. The air was filled with the drone of unseen insects. Once, they came upon a place where broken weapons and bones jutted from the earth, relics of some forgotten skirmish from ages past. Eofred felt a chill that no sun could warm. By afternoon, they reached a stretch of ground, firm enough for horses to gallop. There the tracks turned sharply toward the north, and to their surprise, a faint column of smoke rose in the distance. They urged their mounts forward, weapons ready. When they reached the rise, they saw it. An old watchtower, crumbling and half sunk in the mire, built long ago in the days when Gondor's borders still stretched this far. Around it lay a circle of sharpened stakes, and within, the orcs had made their refuge. Dozens of wargs prowled outside the walls, snapping and snarling. "Musgul's den," said Harnulf grimly. "He's trapped himself. Or trapped us," Eofred answered. "Still, we've come too far to turn back." They withdrew a short distance and made ready. Each man checked his weapons once more, binding the reins tight and whispering a last word to his horse. Then Eofred gave the signal. The riders burst from the mists, their horns sounding clear and fierce. The orcs shouted in alarm, rushing to meet them, but the charge struck like a thunderbolt. Spears splintered, blades sang, and the wargs screamed as they fell. The tower's base became a whirl of motion and blood. Eofred fought his way through the press, his sword flashing like fire in the half-light. He saw Musgul atop the broken steps of the tower, shouting orders, his black helm glinting. With a cry, Eofred drove toward him. "Musgul, your terror ends here!" The orc turned, baring his fangs in a cruel grin. "Ends? No, rider, it begins! You've ridden into your grave!" He raised a horn of his own and blew it. The sound was harsh and deep, rolling across the marshes like thunder. From the east came an answering roar. Out of the fog surged more orcs, scores of them, reinforcements drawn from the swamps, their armor slick with filth. They fell upon the rider's flank, and the battle turned. Eofred felt the ground shake beneath him. He looked to his men. So few now, yet still they fought with the fury of the mark. Harnulf slew a warg and fell beneath another. The world became a blur of steel and flame and cries. Yet even amid the chaos, Eofred pressed on. He reached the foot of the tower and leapt from Faerowind's back, driving forward on foot. Musgul's laughter echoed from above. "So ends the pride of Rohan," the Orc Lord mocked. "Tell your king the White Hand rules now." Eofred said nothing. With a shout, he sprang up the steps, his blade flashing. Musgul swung his curved sword, but Eofred caught the blow, sparks flying. They fought amid the broken stones, the marsh wind howling about them. Steel rang upon steel, and blood stained the ancient stones once more. At last, Eofred struck a glancing blow across Musgul's chest, driving him back. But before he could finish the stroke, the warg master uttered a guttural word, and the ground trembled. Beneath the tower, a hidden pit gave way, and Eofred fell, the stones collapsing in a roar of dust and darkness. When he came to, he lay half buried among the rubble, the sounds of battle distant above. Through the shattered stones, he saw the black shape of Musgul fleeing once more into the mists. The hunt was not yet over, and in the marshes of Rohan, the shadow of Isengard grew ever longer. When Eofred awoke, the air was thick with dust and silence. He lay amid the ruins of the old tower, broken stones and shattered beams strewn across his body. The faint light of dawn filtered through a gap in the crumbling wall, casting long bars of gold and shadow over the debris. Every breath was sharp with pain, yet the sound of distant battle spurred him to move. He pushed himself free of the rubble, wincing as his ribs protested. Blood trickled down his brow where a stone had struck him, but his hand still found the hilt of his sword. The clash of steel and the cries of men came faintly from above. Through a rent in the wall, he could see the marsh beyond, veiled in smoke. The riders of Rohan still fought, but the tide had turned. Eofred rose unsteadily, gripping a broken pillar for balance. He found a narrow passage leading upward, once part of the tower's stair. The steps were half collapsed, but he climbed them nonetheless, his breath ragged. At the top, he emerged into a ruin open to the sky. The sight before him chilled his heart. The ground below was a churned sea of bodies, riders and orcs locked in brutal struggle. The cries of the wounded mingled with the roars of wargs. The banner of the White Hand fluttered above the field like a wound against the dawn. Harnulf's men still fought, their spears rising and falling amid the press. But they were few. Harnulf himself stood upon a mound of dead, his spear broken, fighting now with a sword taken from an orc. His face was pale with blood loss, but his voice still rang out clear. "Rohan, for the king! Drive them back!" Eofred's heart burned with pride and fury. He raised his sword high and gave a cry that rang over the ruin. "Riders of the Mark, hold fast! Hold, I say!" The men looked up, and for a moment their courage blazed anew. They closed ranks, striking with renewed strength. Eofred leapt down from the ruin, landing hard upon the marshy ground, and drove straight toward the heart of the fight. He cut through two orcs in his path, his blade singing as it struck. A warg lunged from the side, jaws gaping. He thrust upward, piercing its throat. The beast fell, dragging its rider down with it. "Musgul!" Eofred roared. "Show yourself, coward!" The name carried across the field, and from the smoke came an answering snarl. Musgul stood upon a mound of corpses, his black armor dented and smeared with blood. His helm was gone, revealing a face as pale as bone beneath streaks of ash and filth. His eyes burned with red fire. "Still you live?" he growled. "Then I shall end you myself." He raised his curved blade, and the two charged. Their swords met in a clash that rang like thunder. Musgul was strong, stronger than any man Eofred had faced. His blows fell like hammers, driving Eofred back step by step through the mud. But the rider's will did not falter. With every strike he parried, with every retreat he found his footing anew. "Murderer of the helpless," Eofred spat. "Slayer of the innocent, you will answer for the villages you burned." Musgul laughed, a harsh and bitter sound. They were weak. Fire cleansed their fear. So will it cleanse you. He swung his sword in a great arc, forcing Eofred to his knees. The blade glanced off Eofred's mail, tearing through the rings. Pain flared along his side, but he twisted and struck back, slashing across Musgul's arm. Black blood sprayed, and the orc howled. In that moment, Ferroin came galloping through the chaos, riderless, her mane streaked with foam. She crashed into the fray, striking a warg aside. Eofred seized the chance, leaping onto her back. With a shout, he spurred her forward, driving at Musgul. The Orc Lord turned, raising his sword, but Eofred's lance, snatched from a fallen rider, struck true. It drove through Musgul's shoulder, hurling him backward. Yet even wounded, the creature did not fall. With a roar, he tore the shaft free and vanished into the smoke, retreating toward the fens. The riders gave chase, cutting down the stragglers of the legion, but the marshes swallowed the orcs swiftly, their forms lost in the grey haze. When at last silence fell, only the moans of the wounded remained. Eofred dismounted, standing amidst the fallen. The battle was over, but not won. Harnulf lay nearby, pale and still, his hand upon the hilt of his sword. Eofred knelt beside him. The old rider's eyes fluttered open. He runs east," Harnulf whispered. "Into the forest. The shadows move there. Beware, Eofred. Not all foes bear iron." Then his eyes closed, and he was gone. For a long moment, Eofred said nothing. He bowed his head, the weight of loss pressing heavy upon him. Then he rose, his face set with grim resolve. "We bury our dead," he said to the few who remained. "And then we ride. Musgul's trail leads toward Fangorn. We'll end this before darkness takes root again." By sunset, the dead were laid to rest in shallow graves among the reeds. The riders of Rohan stood silent as Eofred spoke the old words of farewell, the wind carrying their vow over the marshes. Then, as twilight deepened, they mounted once more. They rode eastward beneath the rising moon. The mists parted before them like torn cloth, revealing the shadowy line of Fangorn's edge. No birds sang there, and the air grew colder with each league. At last they reached the first trees, great grey trunks like pillars, their crowns lost in gloom. The forest breathed softly, as if alive. The riders hesitated at its threshold, for none entered that place willingly. Eofred turned in the saddle, his gaze sweeping over his weary men. "If any would turn back, none shall think less of him," he said. No one moved. The silence of Rohan's sons was answer enough. Then Eofred drew his sword and raised it high, the moonlight glinting along its edge. "For Rohan and for the fallen," he cried, "let no shadow stand unchallenged." And together they rode beneath the ancient boughs, where moonlight faded into twilight, and the air was filled with whispers older than men. Deeper they went, through paths overgrown, and roots that seemed to twist as they passed. Strange eyes glimmered in the darkness. The forest was not empty. Something stirred among the trees, slow and watchful. Once they heard a low groan, like the creak of an ancient door, and the ground itself seemed to tremble. The horses snorted and shied, their ears flicking nervously. "Peace," Eofred murmured, stroking Fairwind's neck. "We mean no harm." But the forest did not answer. Far ahead, through the veil of mist, a faint red glow flickered. Firelight, deep within the wood. Eofred's heart quickened. Musgul was there. He motioned for silence, and the riders advanced slowly, the sound of their passage no louder than the sighing of the wind. The glow grew brighter, the crackle of flames clearer. They emerged at last into a small clearing, ringed by towering trees. There, beside a smouldering fire, crouched the remnant of the Legion, Musgul and his surviving orcs. Their armor was rent, their faces streaked with soot, but their eyes still burned with hate. Musgul turned as Eofred stepped into the light. "So," he hissed, "the Horse Lord comes to die in the wood." Eofred raised his sword, his voice calm and cold. "No, Musgul. I come to end what you began." And in the shadow of Fangorn, the last battle between rider and orc began anew, watched by unseen eyes among the trees, ancient and patient as the hills themselves. The night in Fangorn was unlike any Eofred had known. The forest seemed alive, breathing and watching. Each creak of a bough, each sigh of the wind through leaves, carried a whisper that made even the bravest rider glance over his shoulder. The air hung heavy with age, older than Rohan, older even than Gondor. The clearing where the orcs camped glowed with a dull, red light. Musgul's followers crouched around their fires, their eyes glinting like embers. The smell of smoke and unwashed flesh drifted through the trees. They were weary, wounded, but still dangerous, cornered beasts with nowhere to run. Eofred crouched behind a fallen log, watching through the gloom. Beside him, the last of his riders waited in silence, their faces pale beneath their helms. Only 10 remained, 10 against more than 40. Yet none faltered. He studied the camp carefully. The orcs had raised a rough barricade of branches and stones, and their wargs prowled restlessly along the edge of the firelight. Musgul himself stood apart, staring into the darkness with a strange, tense stillness. His armor was cracked, his arm bound with a strip of blood-soaked cloth, but the cruel gleam in his eyes had not dimmed. Eofred felt the weight of decision upon him. He could wait until dawn, but in this forest, dawn brought no comfort. The air itself seemed to thicken with unease. The trees loomed close, their roots coiling like sleeping serpents. Somewhere deep within, a sound rumbled, slow, distant, and filled with an ancient anger. At last, he turned to his men. "We strike now," he whispered, quick and silent. "Cut the wargs first, then Musgul." The riders nodded. They moved as shadows, spreading out through the undergrowth. The damp earth muffled their steps. Eofred drew his blade and whispered a quiet prayer to Bema, god of horses and warriors. Then, with a sharp whistle, he gave the signal. The riders burst from the darkness like thunder after silence. Swords flashed, and the first warg fell with a strangled cry. Panic swept the camp. Orcs shouted and scrambled for weapons, but the riders were among them before they could form ranks. Eofred's sword struck true, cleaving through armor and bone. He wheeled Fairwind, cutting down another foe. The firelight flickered wildly as bodies crashed against the burning logs. Harnulf's son, young Elric, the last of his line, fought at Eofred's side, his face grim and set. "Musgul!" Eofred shouted, his voice rising above the din. "Your hour has come." The Orc Lord turned, his blade already drawn. "You fool," he hissed. "You've brought death into the wrong forest." Before Eofred could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered. The flames quivered, throwing wild shadows upon the trees. A deep, groaning voice rolled through the wood like thunder from beneath the earth. "Room! What is this fire in my wood?" The sound silenced all. Even the orcs froze. The trees themselves seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking. From the darkness beyond the clearing, something vast began to move. A shape emerged, tall as the tower of Meduseld, clothed in bark and moss, with eyes like deep wells of green light. An Ent, one of the shepherds of the trees. The great being stepped forward, its weight making the ground tremble. It looked upon the burning camp, and its voice rumbled again. "Room! Foul folk with fire and axes, breaking and burning, always burning." The orcs shrieked in terror. Musgul raised his blade, snarling, "Back, monster! This wood will burn like the rest." The Ent's gaze fell upon him, slow and terrible. "Burn?" it said softly. "We will see what burns." In an instant, its long arms swept down. 2 orcs were caught and crushed as though they were made of straw. The wargs turned and fled, but the forest itself seemed to come alive. Roots twisting, branches striking. The very trees groaned with fury. Eofred shouted to his men, "Hold fast! Aid the Ent if you can!" He spurred Ferrowind forward, slashing at the orcs who sought to flee. Chaos ruled the clearing, flames flaring high, smoke thickening, beasts screaming. Musgul fought like a mad thing, his strength redoubled by desperation. He struck down 2 riders, roaring defiance at the towering Ent. The ancient being bent low, its eyes burning with wrath. It reached for him, but Musgul leapt aside and drove his sword into its barked arm. Black sap spilled forth. The Ent gave a cry that shook the forest. A sound of pain and rage mingled. "Filth!" it bellowed. "I will crush you into the roots!" Eofred rode hard, drawing Musgul's attention away. Their blades met once more, sparks scattering. "You'll not defile this forest!" Eofred cried. Musgul's laughter was harsh. "The White Hand reaches everywhere. Saruman's fire will cleanse this age." Their swords locked. Eofred twisted, driving his knee against the orc's wounded arm. Musgul staggered, snarling. In that heartbeat, Eofred struck, his blade sliding beneath the creature's guard, plunging deep. Musgul gasped, black blood pouring from his mouth. His eyes blazed one last time. "The White Hand will rise," he hissed, and fell. The Ent raised its arm, as though to crush the body, but Eofred lifted a hand. "Hold, mighty one, he is finished. His evil ends here." The Ent regarded him in silence for a long moment. Then it nodded, slow as the turning of the earth. "Room, you are no burner. You are of the horse folk. You may stay a while." The forest quieted. The flames dwindled as if smothered by unseen hands. The surviving orcs fled into the dark, and none pursued them. Eofred dismounted, breathing hard. Around him, his men stood exhausted but alive. Elric knelt beside the fallen orc lord, his face pale. "It's done," he whispered. "Aye," said Eofred softly. "But the war that breeds, such as him, has only begun." The Ent leaned down, its great eyes thoughtful. "Fire and metal come from the west now," it said. "A wizard's hand stirs the wild things to anger. Tell your king, the wood remembers." Eofred bowed low. "I will bear your warning." The Ent straightened, towering once more among the trees. "Then go, rider of the mark, and may your people learn to tread lightly beneath the green." As dawn broke, the riders left the forest. Behind them, the trees closed their ranks, sealing the scars of battle. The air was cool and still, and the mists of the marsh had faded. Eofred rode in silence, the wind brushing his face. In his heart, he carried the memory of the battle, the fire, the fury, the voice of the ancient being that had risen in the hour of need. When they reached the plains once more, he paused and looked back. The edge of Fangorn lay quiet beneath the morning sun, yet somewhere within he thought he heard a faint, deep voice, murmuring to the trees. He turned his gaze eastward, where the land stretched toward Isengard. A shadow seemed to linger there, dark and growing. "The White Hand," he murmured. "So it begins." And spurring his horse, Eofred rode on toward Edoras to bring warning to Theoden King of the legion of terror that had risen and fallen, and of the greater war that was yet to come. The road to Edoras wound long and empty through the plains. The grass bent in endless waves beneath the wind, whispering like the sea, and the peaks of the White Mountains loomed pale and distant in the west. For many leagues, Eofred and his men rode without word or song. Their hearts were heavy, their company small. Only 6 riders returned from the marshes and the wood. The rest lay in the earth of Rohan, beneath cairns raised by their brothers' hands. The horses sensed the sorrow of their masters. Even Ferewin, proud and swift, moved with quiet grace, her head low. The sun hung dim behind thin veils of cloud, and the wind from the mountains was chill. By evening, they reached the ford of the Entwash. The water ran swift and clear, murmuring over the stones. There they halted to rest. The men built no fire, for their hearts were still wary of the dark. Instead, they sat by the riverbank, their cloaks drawn tight, listening to the whisper of the current. Eofred sat apart, gazing into the flowing water. His mind was a storm of memory, the smoke of burning villages, the cries of his fallen riders, the words of the Ent echoing like distant thunder. Fire and metal come from the west now. A wizard's hand stirs the wild things to anger. He thought of Saruman, the White, the wise one of old who dwelt in Isengard's ringed tower. Eofred had never seen him, but tales told of his counsel to kings, his voice that could bend the hearts of men. Yet now the shadow of his hand reached even into Rohan's wild places. A voice drew him from his thoughts. "Captain," said Elric softly, approaching. "The men ask, what will we tell the king?" Eofred turned, studying the young rider. His eyes were earnest, though weariness lined his face. He could not have seen more than 20 summers, yet he had fought like one twice his age. "The truth," Eofred answered. "We tell him what we saw. Orcs from Isengard, bred in secret. Wargs tamed for war. The mark of the White Hand raised in defiance of the mark. Theoden must know." Elric nodded, his jaw set. "Do you think the king will believe that Saruman breaks faith?" For a moment, Eofred hesitated. The thought was bitter. Theoden had long trusted the wizard's counsel, yet trust could be a blinding thing. "He will believe," Eofred said at last. "He must. The fate of Rohan may depend upon it." The night passed quietly. At dawn, the riders forded the river and pressed on. The land rose gently as they approached the heart of the mark. Herds of wild horses grazed in the distance, their manes streaming like silver under the morning light. For the first time in many days, the air smelled clean, free of ash and blood. When the golden roofs of Edoras came into view, gleaming upon the green hill, the riders lifted their heads. The great hall of Meduseld shone above the town, its thatch bright as sunlit gold. Smoke curled peacefully from the homes below, and the banners of the horse lords fluttered in the wind. It was a sight of home, yet Eofred's heart did not lighten. They passed through the gates, greeted by guards who stared wide-eyed at their battered armor and blood-stained cloaks. Word spread swiftly through the streets. The people came forth, men, women, and children, calling the riders heroes, though Eofred could scarcely feel worthy of the name. He dismounted before the steps of Meduseld, leaving Ferewin in the care of the stable hands. The doors of the hall stood open, and within, golden light spilled from the hearth fire. Theoden King sat upon his high seat, his face stern and noble, his hair still fair, though touched with grey. Beside him stood his son, Theodred, tall and keen-eyed. When they saw Eofred, they rose in welcome. "Eofred of Aldburg," said the king, his voice strong. "You return at last. We heard rumor of battle on the western borders. Speak, what tidings do you bring?" Eofred bowed low, then stood straight, his bearing proud, despite his weariness. "My lord," he began, "a new terror has risen upon our lands. Orcs ride now upon great wolves, calling themselves the Legion of Terror. They have burned villages along the Entwash and taken captives. Their leader, an Uruk named Musgul, bore the mark of the White Hand upon his banner." A murmur rose among the gathered thanes. Theodred stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "The White Hand? That is the sign of Isengard." "Aye," said Eofred, "and I do not speak of rumor, my lord. I saw it with my own eyes. These orcs came from the west, not the east. Their weapons were forged with cunning craft, their armor wrought with care beyond common orc make. They serve Saruman." Theoden's gaze darkened. "This is grave news indeed." He gestured for Eofred to continue. Eofred spoke of the battle in the marshes, of Musgul's fall, and of the Ent that had risen in wrath to defend its forest. When he spoke of the ancient being's warning, silence fell upon the hall. "A wizard's hand stirs the wild things to anger," Theodred repeated softly. "There can be no mistaking it." For a long while, Theoden sat without word. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows in his eyes. At last, he spoke. "Saruman was once our ally, trusted by the stewards of Gondor and by kings before me. If what you say is true, then Rohan stands in peril, greater than any since the dark years of Helm Hammerhand." Theodred placed a hand upon his father's shoulder. "We must strengthen the Western Watch. I will ride to the fords of Isen and fortify the garrisons there." Theoden nodded slowly. "So it shall be. And you, Eofred, you have done your king great service. Rest now, and let your wounds mend. But be ready when next I call, for I fear your sword will be needed soon." Eofred bowed deeply. "My life and blade are yours, my king." That night, as the feasting began in Meduseld, Eofred stood apart by the open doors, gazing out over the darkened plains. The stars shone bright, and the wind carried the scent of grass and rain. From within came laughter and the music of harps, yet he felt no joy. He thought of Harnulf and the men who had fallen, of the smouldering ruins by the Entwash, of the dark promise in Musgul's dying words. The White Hand will rise. In the distance, the clouds above the mountains flickered with faint lightning, though no thunder followed. A storm was building, slow and unseen, gathering beyond the borders of the mark. Elric joined him at the doorway, a cup of mead in his hand. "Do you think peace will hold?" he asked quietly. Eofred's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "For a time, perhaps. But peace is only the breath between storms. Saruman will not rest. He tested our strength and found us few. He will come again, with armies." Elric was silent for a moment, then lifted his cup. "Then when he comes, may Rohan meet him, as she always has, on the saddle, with sword in hand." Eofred turned and clasped the young man's shoulder. "That we shall, Elric, son of Harnulf. That we shall." Above them, the wind rose, stirring the golden banners of the hall. The laughter within grew distant, swallowed by the sound of the storm rolling beyond the mountains. And Eofred knew, though none yet saw it, that the shadow of war had already begun to fall upon the Riddermark. But in that moment, he swore an oath in his heart, by his fallen comrades, by the honor of Rohan, and by the freedom of her people, that when the White Hand reached for the mark, he would ride forth once more, and the name of Musgul and his legion would be but the first of many evils struck down by the riders of the king. Spring came late to the Riddermark that year. The snows lingered upon the peaks of the White Mountains, and cold rain swept down across the plains. The grass grew tall and silver-green under the dim skies, but few rode abroad, save the patrols that guarded Rohan's western borders. Rumors ran swift through the halls of the Mark, rumors of movement in the valleys of Isengard, of orcs gathering by night, of the creaking of unseen wheels deep within the ringed tower of Orthanc. Eofred rode often between Aldburg and the fords of Isen, carrying orders from Theodred, who now commanded the western defences. The prince had set his camps along the riverbanks and strengthened every watchpost between the mountains and the plains. Yet even as their spears gleamed in the sun, unease gnawed at the hearts of men. They could feel it, the shadow that crept from Isengard, silent and growing. One evening, as Eofred rode through the camp, he found Theodred standing alone upon a low rise, gazing westward. The last light of the sun fell upon his helm, kindling the horse crest in gold. "You've come from the South Watch?" the prince asked without turning. "Aye, my lord," Eofred replied. "No sign of raiders there, but the herdsmen speak of strange shapes upon the ridges, too large for wolves, too swift for men. And the smoke of forges has been seen in the night." Theodred's jaw tightened. "So it begins again. My father doubts still that Saruman plots our ruin, but I feel it as keenly as you. He tests our borders as a hunter circles wounded prey." "The men hold firm," Eofred said, "but they are few. We cannot guard every pass." "I know." Theodred's eyes darkened. "I have sent word to Gondor, though I fear they will not answer. Their own troubles grow. We stand alone now, Eofred, as our forefathers did in the elder days." Eofred bowed his head. "Then we shall stand as they did, until no foe remains upon our soil." Theodred smiled faintly. So spoke Eorl the Young when he rode to Gondor's aid. Perhaps his courage yet rides with us. As night fell, the camp settled into uneasy rest. Fires burned low, and sentries paced along the river's edge. Eofred lay awake beneath his cloak, listening to the whisper of water and the distant cry of an owl. Sleep would not come easily. Sometime after midnight, the horns of the watchtower sounded. 3 long blasts, sharp and urgent. Eofred sprang to his feet. Across the camp, men rushed for their weapons. Theodred's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Riders to horse! The enemy is upon us!" Dark shapes moved along the far bank of the river, torches flaring like eyes in the gloom. Then came the sound, deep, rhythmic, dreadful, the tramp of many feet. The orcs were crossing. Eofred leapt into the saddle of Faerowyn, drawing his sword. "To the ford!" he shouted. The riders thundered down the slope, spears leveled. The moon broke through the clouds, revealing a host beyond reckoning. Hundreds of orcs and wild men of Dunland, their shields painted with the mark of the White Hand. At their head rode a tall figure in black armor, astride a great grey wolf. A memory struck Eofred like cold iron. The beast was no warg he had seen before. It was greater, broader, its eyes burning with unnatural fire, and upon its rider's helm gleamed a mark he thought long destroyed. The Legion of Terror had returned. Theodred saw it too. "By the Vala," he breathed. "Musgul's breed lives still." The river churned with black bodies as the orcs waded through, their shrieks mingling with the roar of the current. Theodred raised his spear high. "For Rohan, drive them back!" The riders met the assault in a clash of thunder and steel. The first rank of orcs fell beneath their charge, swept aside like reeds before a storm. Spears shattered. Blades rang. Eofred struck down an enemy, then another, the spray of the river mingling with blood. But more came behind. The orcs of Isengard were many and well armed, their lines disciplined, their weapons forged for slaughter. Among them moved strange creatures, half-orcs, larger than men, with faces twisted by cruel craft. The battle raged for hours beneath the cold light of the moon. Eofred fought beside Theodred at the ford's heart, where the current ran swiftest. The prince's spear flashed like lightning, cutting down foe after foe. Yet even he could not stem the tide forever. At last, the riders were forced to fall back to higher ground. Theodred gave the signal, his voice hoarse but steady. "Rally! Rally to the banner!" They gathered upon the ridge, their numbers sorely diminished. Below, the enemy howled in triumph, raising the banner of the White Hand amid the corpses of men and horses. "They hold the ford," said Eofred grimly. "If they break through to the plains, the Westfold will burn before dawn." Theodred wiped the blood from his face. "Then we hold them here, whatever the cost. Send riders south to Helm's Deep. Call for reinforcements. We will not yield this ground." Eofred turned to obey, but even as he did, a shadow fell across the field. From the north came another host, bearing torches and banners of black. The air grew foul with the stench of orc kind. "Another wave," Theodred murmured. "So many." For a moment, despair threatened to claim them. Then the prince raised his spear once more. "No retreat!" he cried. "If this is our doom, let it be worthy of song." The riders answered with a shout that shook the night. They charged again, their hooves thundering, their voices rising in the ancient cry of Rohan. "Forth, Eorlingus!" The battle was a storm of fire and steel. Eofred lost count of the foes he struck. He fought beside Theodred until the first light of dawn, when the sun rose red through the mist, casting long shadows over the field. The ground was black with the dead. At last, a horn sounded in the distance, clear, fierce, and proud. From the south rode reinforcements, led by Grimbold of Westfold and Elfhelm the Marshal. Their banners streamed in the wind, and their charge struck the orcs like a hammer upon iron. The enemy faltered. Panic spread through their ranks. The river ran red as they turned and fled, pursued by the vengeful riders. When silence finally fell, the field was strewn with ruin. Theodred stood upon the bank, his armor dented, his face grey with exhaustion. Eofred rode to him and dismounted. "My lord, the day is ours," he said. Theodred's gaze swept the battlefield. "Aye," he murmured, "but at what cost? Half our strength lies slain, and the foe will come again. Saruman tests us still." Eofred followed his gaze to the ford. Among the fallen orcs lay the body of a great wolf, its eyes staring sightless toward the mountains. Upon its breast was carved a crude mark, the black claw of the Legion. "He was not Musghal," Eofred said softly, "but his kin." Theodred nodded. "Then Saruman breeds them anew. His pits must run deep indeed." The prince turned to his men. "Gather the wounded. Burn the bodies of the enemy. Let no taint remain upon this land." Eofred obeyed, though his heart was heavy. As the sun climbed higher, smoke rose from the pyres along the river, black against the morning sky. The air was thick with the smell of ash and sorrow. When all was done, Theodred called his captains together. "Ride to Edoras," he said to Eofred. "Tell the king what you have seen. The war is upon us. The mark of the White Hand spreads like rot." Eofred saluted, his hand over his heart. "I will not fail you, my lord." Then he mounted Ferrowin once more and turned eastward toward the green hills of home. Behind him, the smoke of the fords rose like a warning to the sky, and the crows circled above the field of the fallen. And in the west, beyond the mountains, the furnaces of Isengard burned brighter, feeding the armies of the wizard who would soon unleash his wrath upon all the Riddermark. The road east from the fords of Isen was silent and grey beneath the morning sun. Eofred rode hard, the hooves of his mare striking sparks from the stony path. The wind carried the scent of smoke behind him, the bitter breath of battle, and the death of many brave men. His cloak was torn, his mail dented, but his purpose burned unbroken. Theodred had charged him to bear word to the king, and no weariness would turn him aside. All through that day he rode, the plains stretching vast and lonely under the high sky. The land seemed hushed, listening. Once he saw a flight of carrion birds wheeling far behind him, black dots against the sun. They circled the fords where the fallen lay. By dusk, the hills of Edoras rose before him, their slopes green in the fading light. The gates of the city were open, and the guards hailed him as he passed, their eyes widening at his torn armor and blood-streaked face. "Captain Eofred returns," one cried, "from the fords of Isen." The cry spread through the streets, drawing folk from their homes. Women and children stared as he passed, whispering his name. But Eofred did not pause. He rode straight to the steps of Meduseld, where torches burned bright in the gathering dark. Inside, the golden hall was full of noise. Voices raised in debate, the tramp of booted feet, the ring of mail. Theoden King sat upon his throne, his hand clenched on the armrest, while Grima, son of Galmod, his pale counselor, bent close and whispered into his ear. At the king's right stood Eomer, marshal of the Riddermark, his tall frame tense with anger barely restrained. When Eofred entered, mud-stained and battle-worn, the hall fell to silence. He dropped to one knee. "My lord king," he said, "I come from the fords. Theodred holds the line, but the enemy grows in number. Saruman's armies march openly now, bearing the white hand." At the name, murmurs rose among the thanes. Theoden's eyes, weary and shadowed, flickered uncertainly. "The white hand?" he said slowly. "Saruman of Isengard was once our friend. Surely you mistake the signs." Eofred lifted his head. "I do not, sire. I have seen his creatures with my own eyes, orcs bred in his pits, twisted half-men with strength beyond measure. They fight with his craft, and bear his mark upon their shields. Theodred's scouts say more legions gather beyond the river. If aid does not come soon, the fords will fall." Grima stepped forward, his thin smile cold. "These are wild tales brought by a weary soldier. Isengard has long guarded the western marches. Would you now accuse your ally of treachery, Captain Eofred? Perhaps the battle has clouded your wits." Anger flared in Eofred's heart, but he mastered it. "My wits are clear, Lord Grima. The smoke of burning men leaves little room for dreams." Eomer's voice cut through the tension like a drawn sword. "Peace, Grima. You call him liar, while his blood is still wet from battle? I trust Eofred's word before any whisper from Isengard." A murmur of assent rippled through the hall. Grima's eyes narrowed, but he bowed slightly. "As you will, my Lord Marshal. I only counsel caution. The king's health wanes. His heart must not be troubled with false alarms." Theoden stirred, as though waking from a long thought. His gaze drifted between the two men. "Enough," he said weakly. "We will hear no more quarrel in this hall. Eofred, you have served Rohan faithfully. Rest, and we shall send word to Theodred in the morning." Eomer stepped forward, his voice rising with conviction. "My king, the morning will be too late. The Westfold burns already. I beg you, let me ride to Theodred's aid with all who can bear arms." Grima's voice slid soft as oil. "A rash move, my lord. To strip the Eastfold of its guard would invite ruin from the Wold and the North. Let Theodred hold his ground. Is he not the king's son and heir? He will not fall so easily." At that, Eofred could remain silent no longer. "He cannot hold alone. My lord, the fords are awash with blood. I saw the foe with my own eyes, thousands upon thousands. Saruman means to break us before the spring harvest." Theoden's eyes closed, and he sank back in his chair. For a moment, he seemed less a king than an old man bowed by care. "Go now," he murmured. "Leave me to think." Eomer looked at Eofred, and in that glance, both men knew the truth. No help would come from Medoras, while Grima's counsel poisoned the king's ear. That night, Eofred found no rest. He sat upon the wall of the city, staring westward. The wind was bitter, carrying faint traces of smoke from beyond the mountains. He thought of Theodred standing at the ford, sword in hand, outnumbered yet unyielding. Eomer came to him near midnight, cloaked in grey. "The king will not act," he said quietly. "Grima has bound his will in chains, but I will not sit idle while my cousin bleeds." Eofred rose swiftly. "Then you mean to ride?" Eomer's eyes shone with fierce light. "Aye, at dawn. Those who still love Rohan more than honeyed words will ride with me. I would have you among them, Eofred." "You have my sword," Eofred said without hesitation. When the first light touched the sky, they rode out from Edoras, Eomer and a small company of loyal riders, swift and silent. The wind whipped their cloaks, and their spears glimmered faintly in the pale dawn. None among them spoke, but the air itself seemed to hum with purpose. They rode hard for 2 days across the green plains, the grass bending like waves before their charge. Once, they met a band of herdsmen fleeing east, their faces white with fear. "The Westfold burns," they cried. "Orcs by the thousands. The fords are lost." Eomer's face went white as chalk. He spurred his horse faster, and the riders followed. The sun sank red behind them, its light bleeding into the horizon like fire. At last, upon the 3rd day, they came to the river Isen, and found ruin. The water ran dark with ash and blood. The fields were trampled, the air thick with smoke. Broken spears jutted from the earth, and the bodies of men and horses lay strewn along the banks. Eofred dismounted in silence. He knelt beside one of the fallen, brushing away the mud. The man's eyes stared blankly at the sky. Upon his breast lay the token of the prince's guard, a white horse upon green. "My lord Theodred," Eomer whispered, searching the field with desperate eyes. "Where is he?" They found him at last beside the river, half buried beneath his slain horse. Theodred's armor was shattered, his sword broken, but his face was calm, as though he had died in peace. Eofred bowed his head, grief tightening his chest. "He held the ford to the last," he said softly. "No man could have done more." Eomer knelt beside his cousin, his hand trembling as he brushed the hair from Theodred's brow. "He died a prince of the Mark," he said hoarsely. "But Rohan will mourn him as a king." For a long time, none spoke. The wind sighed through the reeds, and the river murmured low. At length Eomer rose. His eyes burned with cold fire. "We ride to Edoras," he said. "The king will hear this truth from our own lips, and if Grima's poison still blinds him, then by my hand shall it be cleansed." Eofred met his gaze and nodded. For Theodred, and for Rohan. They buried the prince beneath a mound upon the riverbank, facing the west. where the sun would forever set upon his resting place. Then they turned east once more, their hearts heavy, their swords drawn not for glory, but for vengeance. Behind them, the wind carried a whisper through the grass, soft as sorrow, but steadfast as iron. The White Hand will pay. The riders returned to adore us under a sky bruised by storm. Clouds rolled low above the plains, their edges lit with a pale, sickly fire. The wind moaned across the grasslands, carrying the faint scent of ash from the west. The fords of Isen had fallen. Theodred, prince of the Mark, was dead. Now Eomer and Eofred rode with his body, bearing tidings of grief to a kingdom already trembling on the edge of ruin. Their company was smaller than when they had left. Many had fallen in the pursuit of orcs that scattered after the battle, and others had remained behind to guard the burial mounds. But those who rode still were grim of face, their armor blackened by smoke, and their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The horses bore their sorrow too, moving slower than before, their heads bowed beneath the heavy air. When they reached the city, the gates opened in silence. The guard said no word. They had seen the faces of the returning riders and knew the truth without asking. The streets of Edoras were quiet, the people watching from doorways, fear plain in their eyes. Mothers clutched their children, and old men stood with hands upon the hilts of unused swords. The doors of Meduseld stood wide. Torches burned along the great hall, casting wavering light upon the golden tapestries that told of Rohan's glory. At the far end sat Theoden King, pale beneath the golden canopy, his shoulders bent. Grimmer Wormtongue stood beside him, as always, whispering into his ear. Eomer strode into the hall with thunder in his step, his cloak still spattered with mud and blood. Eofred followed close behind, bearing Theodred's broken sword wrapped in cloth. The king looked up dully as they approached. "You return swiftly, my nephew," he said, his voice slow and frail. "What news from the west? Have the fords been held?" Eomer knelt before him, head bowed. "The fords are lost, my lord. Theodred, your son has fallen in battle." A cry of sorrow rose from the gathered thanes. Theoden did not move at first, as if the words had not reached his heart. Then his face crumpled, and his voice broke like dry wood. "My son, my only son." Grimmer's hand tightened on the king's arm, his pale face smooth as polished bone. "Alas," he murmured, "this is a dark day for Rohan. Yet war spares none who defy the will of Isengard." Eomer's head snapped up. "The will of Isengard," he said, his voice sharp. "You speak as though Saruman were our lord." Grimmer smiled thinly. "And are we not wise to heed his counsel? The wizard's strength grows. None can withstand him. Even now he offers peace, if we but lay down our arms and yield the western lands." A murmur of outrage swept the hall. Eofred took a step forward, anger flashing in his grey eyes. "Yield," he said, "to the murderer of your prince? You would have us bow to the hand that struck him down?" Theoden stirred weakly. "Enough," he whispered. "Peace, all of you." But Eomer would not be silent. "My lord," he said, his voice trembling with fury and grief, "while this snake's tongue drips poison in your ear, your people die. Theodred fought and fell for Rohan, not for Saruman. If we do not strike now, the mark will burn from the Isen to the Entwash." Grimmer's expression hardened. "You dare speak so before your king?" he hissed. "You would defy his word?" "I defy you, Wormtongue," Eomer spat. "You who have turned his heart to shadow. You who would trade Rohan's honor for your own safety." The hall erupted in shouts. Some of the thanes rose, hands upon their swords. Others looked to the king, uncertain. Theoden's eyes darted from one to the other, clouded with confusion and pain. At last, Grimmer's voice cut through the uproar. "Guards," he said coldly. "Seize him." For a heartbeat, none moved. Then, at the king's faint nod, the royal guard stepped forward. Eomer's hand went to his sword, but Eofred caught his arm. "Not here," he murmured. "Not now." With a glare that could have cut stone, Eomer surrendered his weapon. "So be it," he said. "You can chain my body, Grima, but not my will. When Rohan calls for its sons, I will answer, even from a prison cell." Grima smiled, but there was fear behind his eyes. "Take him to the guardhouse. Let him learn obedience." Eofred watched as his commander was led away, the clang of armor echoing through the hall. When the doors closed behind him, he turned to the king and knelt once more. "My lord," he said softly, "I beg you, open your eyes. The same hand that slew your son now reaches for your throne. Saruman is no friend to Rohan. His orcs march even now through the Westfold." Theoden's gaze flickered toward him, and for an instant Eofred saw something stir behind the veil of weariness. Grief, anger, perhaps even shame. But then Grima leaned close again, whispering, and the light faded. "You are weary, Captain," Theoden said faintly. "Go, rest your tongue as well as your sword." Eofred bowed, though bitterness burned in his throat. He left the hall in silence. Outside, the wind howled around the golden roof, rattling the banners. The rain had begun to fall, fine and cold. He found Eomer's guards near the stables, 2 men of the royal watch whom he knew well, Valand and Harik, both loyal to the house of Eorl. They bowed their heads as he approached. "We must free him," Eofred said quietly, "before Grima delivers him to Isengard." Valand hesitated. "The king's order binds us." "The king's will is not his own," Eofred replied. "You know it as well as I. Theodred's death was not the end. It was the beginning of war. If Eomer remains caged, Rohan will fall before the first blow is struck." Harik looked westward, where lightning flared over the mountains. "The people murmur," he said. "They remember the prince's courage. If Eomer rides again, many will follow." "Then we ride tonight," Eofred said. "Gather those you trust. We go south to the muster at Westfold. There we'll raise what men we can and hold until the king's eyes are opened." By midnight, the rain had turned to sleet, drumming softly upon the roofs. Under its veil, Eofred led a handful of riders to the guardhouse. The watchmen within offered no resistance. Some turned away, pretending not to see. Eomer stood within, unchained, his sword returned to him. "I knew you would come," he said simply. "There was no other choice," Eofred answered. Together they rode from Edoras beneath the storm, the gates closing quietly behind them. No horns were sounded, no alarm raised. Only the wind bore witness as the riders of the mark vanished into the dark plains. By dawn they had crossed the Snowbourne and set their faces west once more, toward the burning land of their fathers. Behind them, upon the hill of Edoras, the golden hall gleamed dimly in the stormlight, beautiful still, but bound in shadow. And Eofred swore to himself that before the year's turning, that shadow would be broken, or he would perish beneath its weight. For Rohan, for Theodred, for the honor of the mark, he would ride until his last breath. The dawn that broke over the plains was red as blood. A bitter wind swept from the mountains, carrying the cries of crows that wheeled above the far horizon. Eofred and Eomer rode at the head of a small company, no more than 30 riders in all, their cloaks soaked with rain and their eyes set with grim resolve. Behind them trailed a handful of pack horses, laden with such provisions as they could seize in their flight from Edoras. They rode westward toward the foothills of the White Mountains, where the villages of the Westfold lay smoldering beneath the shadow of war. The land there had once been green and fair, dotted with herds and fields of barley. Now the smoke of burned farms hung in the air, and the ground was scarred by the passage of iron-shod feet. As they rode, they met fugitives along the road, farmers, women, and children fleeing eastward, their carts laden with what little they could save. Many stopped at the sight of Eomer's banner, the white horse upon green, and wept for joy and sorrow alike. "Help us, Lord!" one old man cried, clutching Eomer's stirrup. "The orcs came from the west, with fire and blades. My sons fell at the ford. My home is gone. Where shall we go?" Eomer's face was hard as stone. "Go to Dunharrow, old father. The mountain paths are safe for now. Tell the women there that the sons of Yorl still ride, and the mark shall yet be free." They pressed on until noon, when the storm clouds broke, and the sun shone weakly through. They halted upon a ridge overlooking the plains. Far off, they saw the dark smear of smoke rising where the villages of Garvig and Brithfold had once stood. The sight struck Eofred's heart like a blade. "The work of Isengard," he said. "They waste the land to feed their forges." Eomer's gaze was fixed westward. "Then we shall return the fire they have sown. We cannot wait for orders. If Rohan is to live, we must fight now." Eofred nodded. "Aye, but we are few, and Saruman's hosts are many. We must strike swiftly, where his raiders are weakest." A horn sounded in the distance, thin and wavering. The riders turned sharply. From the south rode a lone horseman, his cloak tattered, his face grey with exhaustion. He reined in before them and slid from the saddle. "My lords," he gasped, "I am Guthric of the Westfold. We were attacked near the Deeping Coombe, orcs by the hundreds, with strange men among them, wild men from Dunland. The stronghold at Helm's Deep stands, but its garrison is sore pressed. Lord Erkenbrand holds yet, though he calls for aid." Eomer's hand closed upon his sword hilt. "Then we ride to Helm's Deep." The men cheered, though their voices were weary. They turned their horses and galloped south, the earth thundering beneath their hooves. All day they rode, crossing rivers and ridges, until the great valley opened before them. The Deeping Coombe, with the Hornburg rising proud against the cliffs of the mountain wall. Smoke drifted from its outer fields, and the sound of distant battle reached their ears. Eomer raised his hand, and they halted upon a high slope. Below, they saw a host of orcs and wild men surrounding the stronghold, their torches burning like a sea of fire. The walls of Helm's Dyke were breached, and the defenders fought upon the causeway, their banners torn and bloodied. "By the Vala," Eofred murmured. "They are too many." Eomer's eyes blazed. "Then let them learn what it is to rouse the wrath of Rohan." He turned to his men. "Ride with me now, for the Westfold, for Theodred, for the Mark." The riders drew their swords and cried as one, "For Theolingus!" They charged down the slope like a storm unleashed. The thunder of hooves rolled across the valley, and the enemy turned in sudden panic. Eomer's spear struck the first orc squarely, hurling it backward into the press. Eofred's blade followed, cleaving through helm and hide alike. The air filled with the screams of the dying. The defenders upon the wall raised a great shout. "The riders come! The riders of the Mark!" Through the smoke and blood, the small company cut its way to the gates. Eomer's voice rang out, "Open! Open for the sons of Rohan!" The gates swung wide, and they rode into the Hornburg's court. Erkenbrand himself stood there, his armor blackened, his face streaked with ash. He clasped Eomer's arm. "By Bema's grace, you came. I thought us lost." "Not while one rider yet draws breath," Eomer said. "But the host outside is vast. How long can you hold?" "Until nightfall, perhaps," Erkenbrand answered grimly. "Their numbers are beyond count. They came by the thousands, and still they come. Then we fight beside you, Eofred said, and we will see how long their courage lasts when the horse lords stand at their side. All that day, and through the long hours of dusk, the battle raged. The orcs hurled themselves against the walls in wave after wave, their ladders rising and falling beneath the blows of the defenders. Arrows darkened the sky. The air was thick with the stench of fire and death. Eofred fought upon the rampart, his sword red with blood. 3 times he was struck, and 3 times he rose again. Beside him, Eomer's spear broke, and he seized a fallen banner to fight with instead. The cries of the wounded echoed from the courtyards below. When night fell, the moon rose pale over the cliffs. The horn of Helm sounded from the tower, its deep note rolling like thunder through the coombe. The enemy wavered, but their captains drove them on with whips and curses. Eofred looked down into the valley, where a new fire had kindled among the ranks of the orcs. Great engines of war were being dragged forward, rams and siege towers, black against the moon. His heart sank. "They mean to break the gate," he said. "Then we meet them there," Eomer replied. They descended to the causeway, where Erkenbrand's guard held the last defense. The great gate trembled beneath the blows of the ram, each strike echoing like the beat of a drum. Splinters flew, the iron hinges groaned. "Hold!" cried Eomer. "Hold for the mark!" The gate burst inward with a roar, and the enemy surged through. The clash that followed was fierce beyond telling. Eofred met the charge head-on, cutting down a massive orc with a blow that split its helm. The flood was unending, but still the riders held their ground. Then, through the chaos, came a sound that stilled every heart. The horn again, louder than before, clear and fierce. From the mountain wall to the east, a new light glimmered, faint at first, then blazing like dawn. The orcs faltered, looking upward. Upon the ridge above the deeping coombe, a host of riders stood arrayed, their spears shining in the light of the moon. At their head rode a tall figure in white and grey, and his voice rang out over the battlefield. "Ride now! Ride for ruin and the world's ending! Forth, Eorlingus!" Eofred's eyes widened in awe. "It is the king!" he breathed. "Theoden rides!" A great cry answered him as the host descended like a wave of light. The orcs broke and fled, their courage shattered. The riders fell upon them from above, their swords gleaming, their war cries filling the night. The tide of battle turned, the enemy scattered, hunted down amid the darkness. The fire of Isengard was quenched in the blood of its servants. When dawn rose at last, the fields of the deeping coombe were strewn with corpses. Smoke drifted over the plain, but the air was clean again, the stench of death fading with the morning wind. Eofred stood upon the wall beside Eomer and Erkenbrand, his armor dented and his sword broken, yet his spirit unbowed. Below them, Theoden King rode through the gate, the banner of the horse lords streaming in the light of the new day. "Look," said Eomer softly. "The dawn returns to the mark." Eofred bowed his head. "Aye," he said, "but the shadow of Isengard is not yet ended. Saruman's tower still stands, and the war has only begun." The king's horn sounded again, and its echo rolled far across the plain, a promise and a warning both, to friend and foe alike, that Rohan had risen, and the riders of the mark would not rest until the darkness was driven from their lands forever. Morning broke pale and clear over the valley of Helm's Deep. The smoke of battle drifted like grey veils through the air, mingling with the scent of trampled grass and blood. The cries of the wounded echoed faintly among the rocks, and the crows had already begun to gather upon the heights. Yet through the ruin of the night's slaughter, hope stirred anew. For Rohan still stood, The bodies of orcs and wild men lay strewn across the coombe, their weapons cast aside, their banners trampled into the mud. Among them moved the riders of the mark, weary yet proud, tending to the wounded, binding their comrades' hurts, and giving swift death to those enemies who still crawled upon the ground. The Hornburg's walls were cracked, the gates shattered, but the heart of the fortress had endured. Eofred walked slowly along the ramparts, his mail rent, his sword broken at the hilt. He moved like one in a dream, scarcely able to believe that the sun shone again upon the mark. The memory of the night, the crash of the gates, the roar of battle, the thunder of hooves when Theoden's host came riding down from the hills, still burned bright within him. Below, the king stood amid his guard, his armor blackened with soot, but his eyes alight with a fire long dimmed. Theoden spoke with Erkenbrand and Gandalf, who stood beside him, robed in white. Eofred descended the stair and came before them, bowing low. "My lord," he said, "Rohan is yours again. The Westfold is bloodied but not broken." Theoden looked upon him with grave kindness. "You have fought bravely, Eofred, son of Oldhelm. Long and bitter was the night, yet the dawn has found us steadfast. Rohan owes much to men such as you. The men owe their lives to you, my king," Eofred replied. "Your coming turned the tide." Gandalf's eyes, bright as winter stars, rested on Eofred. "Not all tides turn by chance," he said softly. "Courage kindles courage. The hearts of men remember their strength when hope walks among them." Theoden nodded. "Then let that strength not fail. There is much yet to be done. Saruman's hand reaches still from Isengard, and his will is not broken. We must ride to meet him." At those words, a murmur rose among the riders. Weariness warred with determination in their faces. But Gandalf raised his staff, and the murmuring ceased. "The road to Isengard lies open," he said. "The hosts of Saruman are scattered, their spirit broken. Now is the hour to end this war, before the darkness gathers anew." Theoden's gaze turned westward, where the mountains met the plain. "Then we ride," he said, "and bring judgment upon the traitor who dared defy the kings of Rohan." Before noon, the riders assembled in the field before the Hornburg. The fallen were laid to rest beneath great mounds of stone, their swords upon their breasts, their helms turned to the sky. The king himself spoke the ancient words of farewell, his voice clear and strong. "Rest now, brave sons of the Mark. You have ridden your last ride, but your valor shall not be forgotten while the grasses of Rohan yet grow." When all was made ready, Theoden mounted his white steed, Snowmane, and raised his sword high. Its blade flashed in the sunlight, and the host lifted their spears in answer. "For Theolingus!" he cried, and the valley rang with the shout. They rode from Helm's Deep in a long, shining line, banners streaming, the hoofbeats of their horses echoing like thunder. Gandalf rode ahead upon Shadowfax, swift as the wind, his white cloak billowing behind him. Beside the king rode Eomer, tall and proud, his eyes alight with vengeance for his cousin's death. And among the captains of Rohan rode Eofred, his spirit kindled anew, though his body still bore the weight of battle. The land they passed bore grim witness to Saruman's war. Villages lay in ruin, fields blackened by fire, trees felled and left to rot. The air grew foul with the stench of smoke and burning pitch. Yet the farther west they rode, the stronger their purpose grew, until all fear was burned away, leaving only the fierce pride of the Rohirrim. As they neared the ringed vale of Isengard, the wind shifted, bringing with it the sound of rushing water, a deep, rumbling flood that seemed to shake the very ground. The riders halted upon a rise, and a sight of wonder met their eyes. The once green valley of Nan Curunir was drowned. The river Isen, swollen and wild, had burst its banks and poured through the gates of Isengard. The mighty ring wall that had encircled the tower of Orthanc was shattered in places, and the pits where Saruman's forges had burned now lay flooded. The black smoke of his furnaces had been quenched, replaced by the glimmer of sunlight upon water. And amid that ruin stood two strange figures, tall and gnarled, like the trunks of ancient trees, their long arms raised in triumph. "Ents," Ealfred murmured, awe in his voice. "The shepherds of Fangorn." "Aye," said Gandalf, his eyes gleaming. "The forest has answered the wrongs done against it. Saruman's works are ended." They rode down into the valley, their hooves splashing through the shallow flood. Around them lay the wreckage of war, broken machinery, felled timbers, and the carcasses of half-burnt wargs. At the heart of it all rose the black tower of Orthanc, tall and unbroken, its dark stone gleaming like wet obsidian. At the base of the tower stood Saruman himself, pale and proud, his white robes stained with mud. His eyes were cold as glass. Upon the steps before him stood Treebeard, eldest of the Ents, his massive form like a living monument of bark and stone. "So," said Saruman, his voice smooth and mocking, "the Horse Lords come at last to see the ruin of their master's enemy, and perhaps to claim his thanks?" Theoden rode forward. "You were no master of ours, traitor. You brought fire and death to my lands, and the blood of my son cries out from the fields you burned. For that, there can be no thanks." Saruman's gaze flicked to Gandalf. "And you, grey fool, now white, I see, have turned even the simple hearts of Rohan against wisdom. You would see me cast down. Yet what power have you now to strike me in my own house?" Gandalf's face was calm, though his voice rang like iron. "I am not come to strike you, Saruman. I am come to cast you out. The staff you wield was given for the service of others, not for your own pride. By the authority of the White Council, I command you. Your staff is broken." Saruman laughed, but the laughter died upon his lips as Gandalf raised his hand. A flash of light burst forth, and a crack like thunder echoed through the valley. Saruman's staff splintered in his grasp, its shards falling into the flood. For a moment, silence reigned. Then the wind rose, and Saruman staggered back, his face white with fury and fear. "Go now," said Gandalf. "Your power is ended. The last walls of your pride have fallen. The free peoples of Middle-earth will no longer bow to your will." Saruman turned without a word and fled into the shadows of his tower. The gates of Orthanc closed behind him with a sound like the tolling of doom. Theoden gazed long upon the dark tower. "So ends the treachery of Isengard," he said softly. "But what of the war beyond? For I fear this was but one arm of a greater shadow." Gandalf's eyes turned eastward, where the distant mountains of shadow loomed faintly through the haze. "The storm has broken in Rohan," he said, "but its heart beats still in Mordor. The eye of Sauron turns now upon all lands. Yet take heart, for Rohan has shown that even the smallest flame may drive back the dark." Ealfred bowed his head, the wind tugging at his torn cloak. He looked upon the shining water that now filled the vale, and thought of the journey that had brought him here. The burning villages, the battles, the long rides through shadow and despair. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of true hope. The riders of Rohan turned their faces toward home, the sunlight gleaming upon their helms. Behind them, Orthanc stood silent amid the ruin of its making, a warning to all who would raise pride above mercy. and though Eofred knew the war was not yet won, he felt within his heart that the mark would stand, enduring, defiant, and free, so long as the grass grew green beneath the open sky of Middle-earth. The journey back from Isengard was long and heavy with memory. The riders of Rohan moved through lands, scorched and broken, where the scent of smoke still lingered, and the cries of ravens echoed in the sky. Yet there was peace in the hearts of men, a weary peace, hard won, like sunlight after storm. The white horses of the Mark trod softly upon the sodden fields, and for the first time in many months, no shadow of pursuit followed them. Eofred rode beside King Theoden as they crossed the fords of Isen once more. The river, swollen with spring rains, murmured over the stones as though whispering the names of those who had fallen in its defense. Theoden dismounted and stood upon the bank. His gaze wandered westward, where the hills of the Westfold lay green again under the touch of spring, though the ruins of battle still scarred the land. Here his son had fallen. The thought lay plain upon the faces of all who stood with him. Theoden knelt and gathered a handful of the river's water in his palm. "Theodred, my son," he said softly, "your father rides home at last, but you shall not ride beside him. May your spirit guard these lands you loved." None spoke as he rose. Eofred bowed his head, remembering the prince as he had last seen him, standing proud amid the ford's bloodied waters, holding back the tide of Saruman's hordes. He vowed then that Rohan would never forget the sacrifice of its prince. They rode on eastward, their banners bright in the morning light. The road wound through valleys where new grass had begun to grow among the ashes. At every village, the folk came forth to greet them, women and children waving, old men weeping for joy. The name of Theoden was shouted from the doorways, and the sound of it carried like music upon the wind. But Theoden's heart was not light. Though victory had been won in the west, he knew that greater trials lay ahead. Rumors had already reached them of war stirring in the east, of black banners raised in Mordor, and the armies of the Dark Lord marching upon Gondor's borders. At the king's command, the riders made camp one night upon the wide plain before Edoras. Fires burned bright against the chill, and the sound of song rose faintly into the clear sky. Eofred sat apart from the others, his cloak drawn close, staring toward the mountains where the moonlight glimmered upon snow. Eomer joined him there, his face shadowed but resolute. "The king grows weary," he said quietly, "yet his spirit is strong. Since Isengard's fall, a new light burns in him. He speaks now of alliance, of riding east to the aid of Gondor." Eofred nodded slowly. "It is as it must be. The war that began in the Westfold will not end until the shadow in the east is broken. The hand of Saruman was but the servant of a darker will." They spoke long into the night of what was to come. Eofred listened as Eomer told of riders sent north to muster reinforcements, of smiths laboring day and night to reforge broken arms, of women and children being led to the safety of the mountains. The Mark prepared itself for war once more, war greater than any it had known since the days of Helm Hammerhand. When morning came, a pale mist lay over the plains. The horns of Rohan sounded clear and cold. The host rode forth to Edoras, where the golden hall of Meduseld shone upon the green hill. It seemed brighter now than before, for the shadow that had lain upon it had been lifted. Theoden rode first through the gates, and the people fell to their knees as he passed. He dismounted before the steps and raised his hand in greeting. "My people," he said, "the fire of Isengard is quenched, and the foe that sought to break our strength lies in ruin. But our victory is not yet complete. The Dark Lord gathers power in the east, and his gaze falls upon all three lands. We must stand beside our brothers in Gondor, or fall alone. A great cheer rose from the crowd, their voices echoing across the hills. Hope stirred in every heart, though fear walked beside it, for all knew the road ahead would lead them into darkness such as few could imagine. In the days that followed, Eofred remained in Edoras to oversee the rebuilding of the Western Watch and the gathering of the riders. The mead hall once again rang with the sound of hammers and song. Armor was mended, swords sharpened, and new steeds were brought from the herds of the Eastfold. Every man who could wield a spear came forward, and even the greybeards took up their old blades. One evening, as Eofred stood upon the terrace overlooking the plains, a soft voice spoke behind him. "You have done much for Rohan, Captain," said Theoden. "Few have borne so heavy a burden with such steadfast heart." "My lord honors me," Eofred replied. "I have only done what duty demands." Theoden smiled faintly. "Duty, yes, but not all men hold to it so when darkness falls. You have stood beside your king in his blackest hour. I will not forget it." He looked eastward, where the horizon was lost in haze. "Soon I will ride to war once more. Will you ride with me, Eofred?" "Always, my king." The old king's eyes shone with pride. "Then may we bring glory to the mark once more." When he had gone, Eofred lingered alone. The wind carried the scent of rain and the distant cry of night-birds. His thoughts turned to the road that lay ahead, to the dread shadow rising in Mordor, to Gondor's white walls, to the black plains where armies would soon clash. Yet beneath all his fear, there was a fierce joy. For the first time in many years, the heart of Rohan beat as one. In the weeks that followed, word came from the east that Gondor had called for aid. The red arrow, token of ancient alliance, had reached the king's hand. Theoden called his captains to council, and Eofred stood among them as the king spoke. "Long have we ridden alone," Theoden said, "but the time has come to fulfill the oath of Eorl the Young. We ride to Gondor's aid, to stand against the storm of Mordor. Let the Dark Lord learn that the sons of Rohan do not forsake their friends." The horns of Edoras answered his call. Messengers rode to every corner of the mark. Within days, the fields below the city were filled with the gleam of spear points and the sound of mustering. Eofred walked among the ranks, greeting old comrades, heartened by their courage. The young and the old alike came forward, eager to follow their king into battle. On the eve of their departure, Theoden stood once more before the gathered host. "Tomorrow we ride," he said, his voice strong, carrying over the plains. "Ride for Gondor, ride for the mark. Let no shadow hinder our path. For Rohan." And the riders answered with one mighty voice that shook the walls of Edoras. For Rohan, for the king. That night, Eofred could not sleep. He stood at the stable door, watching the stars wheel slowly above the mountains. Faerowyn stamped her hooves beside him, eager for the road. He laid a hand upon her mane. "Tomorrow we ride again, old friend," he whispered. "Whatever comes, we shall not turn from it." When dawn broke, the fields of Edoras shone like bronze in the rising sun. The host of Rohan gathered, banners snapping in the wind. Theoden mounted Snowmane, and Eofred took his place beside Eomer, beneath the green banner of the mark. The horns sounded, bright and clear. The gates of the city swung wide, and the king's voice rang out, "Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Spears shall be shaken, shields splintered. A sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises." And the great host rode forth from Edoras, thundering across the plain, their cry echoing to the farthest hills. For Theorlingus. Behind them, the morning sun touched the golden roof of Meduseld, and for a moment It gleamed like fire upon the hill, a beacon of hope for all the free peoples of Middle-earth. The host of Rohan rode forth like a great river of steel and sunlight. From the gates of Edoras they thundered eastward, banners streaming, their voices lifted in song. The plains trembled beneath the hooves of many thousands, and the sound of their coming rolled across the hills like thunder. The grass of the Riddermark bowed before them, and the wind carried their cry far and wide. "Forth, Eorlingus!" Eofrid rode among the vanguard beside Eomer, his heart ablaze with pride. All around him shone the helms of the riders, bright as the morning sun. It seemed to him that the spirit of the mark had been reborn, stronger than ever before. Even the oldest men rode with heads high, and the youngest sang of victory. Yet beneath their songs lay a fierce resolve, for each knew the road ahead would lead them into shadow. For 7 days they rode through the leagues of Rohan. The land unfurled before them in rolling green waves, broken only by the dark lines of rivers and the gleam of distant ridges. At night they camped beneath the stars, the fires of their host burning like constellations upon the earth. Eofrid slept little. His thoughts turned ever eastward to Gondor, where the black smoke of Mordor was said to darken the very sky. On the morning of the 8th day, they reached the mouth of the Firion Wood, where the road turned south toward the lands of Gondor. There they found riders waiting, the scouts of Gondor, grim and travel-worn. Their leader dismounted before Theoden, bowing low. "My lord of Rohan," he said, "I bring tidings from Minas Tirith. The hosts of Mordor are abroad. The enemy's armies have crossed the Anduin, and now lay siege to the White City. Lord Denethor calls for aid, and swift, for the darkness gathers by the hour." A murmur swept through the ranks. Theoden's face grew stern. "Then we ride faster than the wind itself," he said. "Tell your lord the riders of the Mark come to his aid." The Gondorian bowed again, tears shining in his eyes. "Hope yet lives, my lord," he said. "Hope rides with you." That night, the camp was quiet. The stars were veiled by clouds, and the wind carried the distant rumble of thunder from the east. Eofrid sat by the fire, sharpening his blade, his thoughts heavy. Eomer approached, his cloak drawn close. "You do not sleep," the marshal said. "I cannot," Eofrid answered. "The air feels heavy, as though the world itself holds its breath." Eomer nodded. "The storm draws near. Tomorrow we ride through the night, and by the second dawn we shall see the beacon hills of Gondor." He paused, his gaze distant. "The eyes of the Dark Lord are fixed upon that city. Yet if we come in time, our swords may still turn the tide." Eofrid looked toward the east, where the faintest red glow marked the horizon. "Then may our horses fly like the wind, for if Gondor falls, no wall in Rohan will stand." The next day dawned grey and grim. The host set forth again, moving swift and silent. No songs rose from their ranks now, only the steady beat of hooves. All laughter was gone. Every man knew the weight of what awaited them. They passed through the mountain vale of Harrowdale and climbed the winding road to Dunharrow, where the women and children of Rohan had taken refuge. The host halted beneath the shadow of the mountain. From the terraces above, the people looked down, their faces pale in the dim light. Theoden dismounted and walked among them, speaking words of comfort. "Fear not," he said. "Your sons and fathers ride to guard your peace. Keep courage in your hearts, for we shall return with the dawn." As the king turned to go, a figure stepped forth from the gathered crowd. A woman, tall and fair, her golden hair bound in a braid. Her eyes shone with sorrow and fire. It was Eowyn, Eomer's sister, shield maiden of Rohan. "Brother," she said, her voice trembling though her gaze did not waver. "You ride to war and leave me behind again. Am I not of the house of Yall? Shall I sit idle while others fight for our land?" Éomer took her hands gently. "Sister, your heart is brave, but our people need you here. Guard those who cannot fight. If we fall, it will be you who must lead them." Tears gleamed in her eyes, but she did not weep. "Then ride, Éomer, and if the darkness should claim you, I will not endure behind stone walls." He kissed her brow and turned away, his face shadowed. Éofred, standing nearby, felt a pang of unease, for he saw in her eyes a fire that would not be quenched by duty alone. At dusk, the host departed from Dunharrow. They rode down from the hills in silence, the long lines of riders winding through the dark valleys like a river of shadows. The wind rose as they went, and far off, thunder rolled again. Overhead, the sky burned faintly red where the east lay. That night they rode without rest. No moon shone, and the stars were veiled, yet the horses found their way by the dim light of the storm. They crossed the stone of Eric and the green fields of Lebanon, their hooves striking sparks from the stones. The men of Gondor's outlands came forth from their villages to watch them pass, calling blessings upon the king of Rohan. By the second dawn, they saw the mountains of Mordor faint upon the horizon, and the air grew thick with ash. From afar, they heard the low thunder of battle and the cries of men and beasts. A dark smoke rose beyond the hills, the burning of Gondor's fields. Theoden rode before his host and lifted his sword. "Now, sons of Eorl," he cried, "we ride to Gondor's aid. Let none lag behind. Ride now, ride to ruin and the world's ending." The horns of Rohan rang out. The riders spurred their horses, and the plain shook beneath them. Éofred felt the wind whip past his face, heard the thunder of hooves, and the rising cry of battle. His heart leapt within him. Fear and glory mingled as one. By nightfall they reached the hills overlooking the Pelennor. There they halted, hidden among the dark slopes. Below them lay the plain of Gondor, lit by fire and war. The city of Minas Tirith shone white in the distance, but its lower walls were veiled in smoke. The hosts of Mordor filled the fields like a black tide, their banners crimson and gold under the shadow of the dark tower. Éofred stared, awe and dread mingling within him. "So this is the war of the great kings," he murmured, "the storm of the world gathered in one place." Éomer drew a long breath. "Aye," he said, "and before this night ends, we shall ride into it." In the valley below, a sudden flare of red light shot into the sky, the fires of the enemy answering the call of battle. Theoden turned to his captains, his eyes gleaming. "Sleep if you can," he said. "At dawn we ride to the aid of Gondor." The riders made their camp upon the hillside, but few found rest. Éofred sat awake, watching the flickering fires below. He thought of Rohan's green fields, of the sound of wind in the tall grass, of all that would be lost if they failed. Then he rose, placed his hand upon his horse's mane, and whispered softly, "Tomorrow, my friend, tomorrow we ride into legend." As he spoke, the first faint light of morning touched the eastern sky, dim and red through the smoke. The horns of Rohan stirred in the darkness, low and deep, their notes rolling like distant thunder. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of war and the promise of glory. And so began the dawn before the greatest ride of the Mark, the last ride of Theoden King, and the hour when the riders of Rohan would carve their names forever into the songs of Middle-earth. The dawn broke red over the fields of Gondor. A murmur like the breath of a waking storm moved through the host of Rohan, for before them lay the greatest battle of their age. Below, The Pelennor burned, a sea of fire and smoke swirling about the white walls of Minas Tirith. The thunder of war rolled ceaselessly across the plains. Dark banners flapped in the wind, emblazoned with the eye of Mordor, and the air was filled with the cries of men and beasts locked in slaughter. Upon the hill, the riders of Rohan stood ready. Their armor glimmered faintly in the light of dawn. Their spears gleamed sharp and cold. The king rode among them, his white horse bright against the gloom. Theoden's face was grave, yet there was a light in his eyes that none had seen for many years. A fire rekindled, burning with the pride of his forefathers. Yoma rode beside him, tall and stern, and Eofred among the captains of the host, his hand resting upon his sword hilt. The wind shifted, carrying with it the stench of death from the plain. Below, the hosts of Mordor surged against the walls of the White City. Great engines hurled stones and fire, battering the gates. The cries of the defenders drifted faintly upward, a song of desperation mingled with courage. Theoden reined in his horse upon the crest of the hill and looked down upon the ruin below. "So this is Gondor's hour of need," he said softly. "Long have we been sundered by silence and pride. But no more. Today we ride for our brothers, for the world of men." He raised his sword high, and the rising sun flashed upon its blade. "Arise now, riders of Theoden. Spears shall be shaken, shields splintered. A sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride to Gondor's aid." Then he struck his spear against his shield, and the cry of the Rohirrim burst forth like thunder. "Forth, Eorlingus!" Down the slope they rode, a storm of horses and steel, their horns calling across the plain. The sound of it broke like a wave upon the city, and hope stirred in the hearts of men who heard it. From the shadowed gates of Mordor's army came shrieks of terror as the orcs turned to face the oncoming charge. The riders crashed into the flanks of the enemy with the force of a tempest. Spears thrust, blades fell, and the plain was filled with the ringing of iron. Eofred rode at Eomer's side, his sword singing as it cut through armor and flesh. The sun rose fully now, its light falling golden upon the white walls of Minas Tirith, and the shadow that had lain over the city seemed to lift. "Forward!" cried Theoden. "Drive them from the field!" They swept through the enemy ranks, cutting them down in their hundreds. The black banners of Mordor wavered and fell. The horns of Rohan sounded again, fierce and clear, and for a time it seemed as though no power could stand against them. Eofred fought like one possessed, his heart filled with the memory of his fallen brothers, Harnulf, Theodred, all the men who had died in the long war for their land. Each stroke of his sword was a vow renewed, but the victory was not yet won. From the east came a new sound, a deep, rumbling roar that chilled the blood. The ground shook beneath the feet of monstrous beasts, and from the darkness beyond, the river came the war elephants of Harad, towering above the field like moving towers. Upon their backs rode men clad in scarlet and gold, their spears glittering in the sun. The charge of Rohan faltered. Horses screamed and reared as the great beasts crashed among them. Theoden's voice rang out, rallying his men, and again they pressed forward, fearless before the tide of horror. Eofred saw one of the beasts bearing down upon him, its tusks gleaming with iron. He spurred Faerowyn forward, darting beneath the creature's flailing trunk, and struck at its leg. His blade bit deep, and the beast stumbled, trumpeting in agony before it fell. When he looked up, he saw the king. Theoden rode at the forefront of the battle, his white horse, Snowmane, rearing high amid the press. The standard of Rohan flew above him, bright against the smoke. But even as Eofred watched, a shadow passed across the sun. Out of the black clouds came a cry, long and terrible, a shriek that pierced the heart like a spear. From the east descended the lord of the Nazgul, the witch king of Angmar, upon his fell beast, vast and winged. The creature swooped low, its shadow falling over the king. Snowmane reared in terror, and Theoden was struck down beneath his own steed. A cry of despair rose from the riders. Eofred felt his heart turn to stone. He spurred his horse forward, but another reached the king before him, a lone warrior, helm gleaming, bearing the standard of Rohan. The warrior's voice rang out, clear and proud. "Begone, foul Dwemer-like! Leave the dead in peace!" The Witch King laughed, cold and cruel. "No living man may hinder me." And then the warrior cast aside the helm, and golden hair spilled forth. "But no living man am I. You look upon a woman of Rohan, Eowyn, daughter of Eomund. You stand between me and my king." Eofred's breath caught. He would have ridden to her side, but something greater held him still, the sight of courage made manifest. The Witch King struck, his mace shattering her shield, but Eowyn rose again, swift as light. With a cry that echoed across the field, she drove her sword into the shadowed helm, and the wraith's cry of death filled the air. The fell beast collapsed, and the Witch King was no more. Silence fell for a heartbeat, a silence heavy with awe and sorrow. Eofred reached the king's side. Theoden lay still, his eyes open to the sky. The color had gone from his face, yet peace rested upon it. Eowyn knelt beside him, her sword fallen, her hand clasped in his. "Forgive me, my king," she whispered. "I could not let you fall alone." Theoden smiled faintly. "You have done bravely, Eowyn, daughter of kings. Now ride forth and remember me. Let not the light of the mark fade." He breathed his last, and the wind carried his final words across the field. Eofred bowed his head, tears burning his eyes. Around them, the battle still raged, but the riders of Rohan gathered close, forming a shield around their fallen king. Eomer came galloping through the smoke, his eyes wild with grief. When he saw his sister kneeling beside the king, a cry broke from his throat. "Eowyn! What madness is this?" He fell to his knees beside her, taking her cold hand in his own. "She lives," Eofred said softly, "but she is sorely wounded." Eomer rose, his face pale and terrible. "Then death itself shall pay for this day's work. Sound the horns. Let the world know that Rohan fights still." The horns of the mark answered, their voices fierce and mournful. The riders gathered around Eomer, and together they charged once more into the heart of the enemy. The battle surged anew, and Eofred followed, his sword red in his hand. Rage and sorrow drove him. Each blow he struck was for his king, for the fallen, for Rohan. When at last the sun set, the fields of Pelennor were strewn with the bodies of friend and foe alike. The shadow of Mordor was broken, and the white banner of Gondor flew once more above the city. But upon the field lay Theoden king, last of the house of Eorl to ride into battle, his body borne upon a bier of spears. Around him stood his people, weary yet unbroken, their faces turned toward the west where the sun sank in fire. And Eofred, standing among them, raised his voice in the ancient song of the Riddermark, a song of kings and riders, of the wind in the grass and the light upon the hills. It was a song of mourning, but also of triumph. For though Theoden had fallen, his spirit rode forever in the hearts of his people, and the name of Rohan would echo through the ages. As the night deepened, the stars kindled above the plains, bright and cold. The wind swept through the field, whispering over the fallen spears. Eofred lifted his gaze to the heavens, and in that moment he knew. Though darkness still lingered in the east, the dawn would come again. Rohan had kept faith, and the riders would ride once more until all shadow was driven from the world.